Virginia Woolf famously said that a woman needs money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. When we consider the idea of a woman in confinement, a number of images may arise. A maiden in a tower, anxiously awaiting her prince, or perhaps the mad woman in the attic, forced to live a life of solitude and confinement, an image immortalized in the character of Bertha Mason in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. But what if I told you that there exists another type of isolation, one that is not confining, but freeing? The idea of the female space is one which has been central to the feminist debate, and which has been consistently navigated and negotiated by female writers throughout history, in response to the structures of power which have been imposed on women's spaces and lives. Many of you may be familiar with the figure of the reclusive female writer, embodied by authors such as Emily Dickinson. At the heart of this idea lies a paradox. Historically, many women have found freedom in solitude and confinement. Now, while this idea may seem implausible, it becomes understandable when we consider the alternative that many women have had to face: conforming to society's expectations of marriage and life in the domestic sphere, which was often a kind of confinement in and of itself. To Virginia Woolf, a woman could not write if she had no place in which to cut herself off from the duties of her daily existence. It is for this reason, she argued, that so few women appear in the canon of authors, particularly before 1700. Today, I'd like to take you back to the 14th century, in the heart of the medieval period, where we encounter some of the earliest texts written by women. But before we begin to consider these authors, it's important that we gain an understanding of how women were viewed in the medieval period. The Middle Ages inherited what we would now call a tradition of severe misogyny from two distinct sources: Judeo-Christian theology and the science of classical antiquity. Medieval theologians looked to the book of Genesis to argue that Eve, rather than Adam, was responsible for bringing original sin into the world. In doing so, condemning the entire female sex to God's punishment through the pains of childbirth and subordination to men. Greek scientific thinkers like Aristotle argued that women were the defective sex, as they were composed of the elements of coldness and moisture, while men were dominated by heat and dryness, which was supposedly a more stable composition. These pseudoscientific understandings bequeathed to the medieval world the view that women were both morally and physically inferior to men. And this dictated women's role in medieval society, or lack thereof. In the Middle Ages, women were not permitted any real role in public life, let alone any authority. Women's lives were limited to taking care of their children and helping their husbands in their various trades and crafts. However, there was an alternative to this domestic life of marriage and childcare. Another option for medieval women was to take the veil and to join a religious order as an anchorite or as a nun. Now, while I'm sure many of you are familiar with the idea of a nun, unless, like me, you are thrilled by the lives of medieval people, you may not be familiar with the idea of an anchorite. An anchoress, or a hermit nun, was a woman who made the decision to live a life of prayer and contemplation, locked into a cell for the rest of her life. The anchoritic life was one of complete sensory deprivation. An anchorite was never to be looked at or seen, and her only interaction would have been with the church. An anchorite's cell, or anchor hold, was about 12 square feet and was completely empty, with only a small window looking onto the outside world, which was to be covered by a black curtain. The daily activities of an anchoress included praying, devotional writing, and even for some, digging the grave they would eventually be buried in, inside their anchor hold. It makes lockdown sound a lot nicer, doesn't it? To a modern audience, the appeal of this way of life seems incomprehensible. But as surprising as it may be, many women chose to become anchorites and to surrender themselves to confinement and to the church. It is only natural then for us to ask, What would lead someone to seek this kind of living death? As we've already seen, the alternative for most women, living a life confined to domestic responsibility, was bleak. But could this really have been worse than being locked in a cell? Could there, perhaps, have been something desirable about the anchoritic life? It's important to bear in mind that the women who became anchorites were extremely devout, so a position within the church would have been desirable in and of itself. But the focus of my talk today is the idea that within monastic walls, women could wield a certain amount of power. The position of an anchoress was one of spiritual authority and social standing. Their advice was often sought on religious matters, and their writing continues to command significant respect. And this is made evident through the fact that the earliest text recorded to have been written by a woman was, in fact, by an anchoress, namely Julian of Norwich. Julian of Norwich, pictured behind me, was a celebrated mystic and anchoress, who you may know for her proverbial line, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." Julian's text, Revelations of Divine Love, is one of the most celebrated works of medieval devotional writing, and is a work of high literary merit in its own right. Julian's beliefs challenge traditional Christian views and remain relevant in today's theological debate. So, considering what we've heard about how women were viewed in the medieval period, this instance of a woman and her ideas being revered in such a way is both unusual and wonderfully powerful. And this was made possible by the fact that Julian was an anchoress in confinement. The precise motivation for the anchorites' enclosure remains a fascinating mystery. Did confinement provide these women with protection from the bleak reality of the real world, a metaphorical hermit's shell? Or was it driven by a willingness of deep devotion to God? Whatever the reason, it is clear that these women were able to create a space for themselves in a society that would not. Enclosure, as unpleasant as it may seem, gave these women the resources and platform to write, something which would have been remarkably rare in the Middle Ages. Not only this, it also gave what they wrote authority, which is what has allowed their text to survive for us to read and admire today. So, to return to the paradox that I presented you with at the beginning of this talk, it is clear that enclosure provided these women with a sense of freedom. While this kind of freedom may seem limited or even incomprehensible, we must not underestimate the social circumstances which faced women like Julian of Norwich. Nor should we overlook what extraordinary things these women were able to achieve in a room of their own. Thank you.